And it's my pleasure right now to introduce Rabbi Evan Moffic. You know, families are at the heart of everything we do, and Evan and his wife Ari have been like wonderful relatives of this family, and we've been so blessed the life cycle events that they've helped us celebrate, the wisdom they've shared, the services they've led. Evan is with us today. He'll be with some families in November at a baby naming and baptism with Father John Cusick. And in January, there'll be an all-school Jewish service that Evan will lead for us. And we got our hooks into him for other stuff. So we're lucky. If you don't know him, he is a guide to Jewish wisdom for people of all faiths. He is the co-leader of Congregation Macomb Solal Lakeside in Hyde Park. He's been featured in the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, The Forward, and Christianity Today, and regularly as a religious commentator on Fox News and CNN. He's the author of several books, including What Every Christian Needs to Know About the Jewishness of Jesus, which is an excellent book, especially for our folks, and also What Every Christian Needs to Know About Passover. So both of those are wonderful. His most recent book, I'm sure that he'll be referring to today, is Reading the Old Testament Through Jewish Eyes, a study of the scriptures, Jesus wrote. So please welcome Rabbi Moffic.
It is so nice to be here and to see all of you. A few couples that I married not too long ago, and just a real delight. Family school is obviously such an important part of Chicago, of my life as a rabbi. My wife, who really was wishes she could be more involved here. She actually had to take she did take a sort of a job running a religious school, but traditional religious school in Northbrook. But I think deep in her heart of hearts, she wishes she could be here more regularly, because she really loves the family school and what's here and what is really done by everyone in this room. So I'm grateful to be here too. And I've actually kind of watched, I mean, not as long as David, but kind of watched the evolution of the family school. Couples that I married 10, 12 years ago who, have older kids now and went through the whole process, and just see, what a unique outlook and really perspective on the world that is nurtured here. And so I think some of you, don't have kids yet or have really young kids, and can just tell you that as time goes on, it's really incredible what comes out of this school and this group. So what I thought we would talk a little bit about today is it is sort of my new book, but it's more what is Torah? We talk about when. How many of you had or have been to bar mitzvahs? Well, how many of you had a bar mitzvah? Bar mitzvah. Okay. You. How many of you have been to bar and bat mitzvahs? Yeah. Okay. Everybody. Okay. Virtually. A lot. Not everybody, but yeah. No, in some place, it is kind of a, it's really a function of where you grow up in a way. And so at a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, a child reads from Torah. That's the whole point. The whole point is to go up and read from the Torah. You say, what is Torah? So Torah is kind of the heart. So if you want to put it up a little bit. Sure, I can hold it. Yeah, would that be better? Okay, good. The whole point of bar bat mitzvah is reading from the Torah. And so understanding what Torah is kind of essential to understanding Judaism and family and what kind of is the core of Jewish life. And so that's kind of what this book was about. And actually started where I was asked to go to give a blessing at a Christian seminary, North Park Seminary. And what had happened is somebody, a philanthropist, had donated a Torah scroll to this seminary. It's kind of interesting. So a Torah scroll in the Christian seminary. And the purpose was to study God's word. This was an evangelical Christian, so not kind of not my perspective, but interesting perspective. So the understanding was to study God's word in its original form. And so he had donated these Torah scrolls, which are sort of you want to say decommissioned Torah scrolls. They were no longer really used in synagogues, but you can't, with a Torah scroll, you don't throw it out. You could bury a Torah scroll, but if it's sort of decommissioned, you can use it in a non-sacred setting. So this guy had purchased several decommissioned Torah scrolls and donated them to different seminaries. And so I gave a blessing there, and I was just kind of fascinated by the idea that in a Christian seminary, a more evangelical seminary, there would be study of Torah, of the Torah scroll. Because that really is sort of that's one of the kind of key differences in some ways between Judaism and Christianity. In Christianity, there is the entire Bible. So in Christianity, the Bible is the Old Testament, which in Hebrew we call the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Torah, prophets, and writings. That's the Old Testament in Judaism. And in Christianity, there's the Old Testament and the New Testament, of course, the Gospels, the letters, and so forth. But generally in Christianity, it'd been pretty much 90-10, 90% emphasis on the New Testament, maybe 10% emphasis on the Old Testament. And suddenly, in a Christian seminary, you've got a Torah scroll being donated. And so there's kind of this sense of what is this Old Testament? Even more so, the Torah is just one part of the Old Testament. Torah is sort of the oldest part of the Old Testament. And so I wanted to say, what is Torah? What does it mean? Not just for Christians, but also for Jews. A lot of Jews really have they know the Torah is in the Ark, and they know it's an ancient book, but kind of don't really understand what is it, why it's important. So that's kind of why I set out to write this. And I came up with a couple of conclusions. In some ways, Judaism is really a text-based religion. If you think about it, the core act, there's prayer in Judaism, but really study of God's word is really central to understanding faithfulness and what it means to be Jewish. And so in some ways, the Torah, from a religious perspective, the Torah in Judaism is kind of like Jesus in Christianity. Because in Christianity, Jesus is God's presence on earth. Right? Christianity, God comes down in human form in Jesus. In Judaism, God comes down through Torah. That Torah is literally God's word. And the way we connect with God is through study of Torah. That literally you're encountering God through the study of the text. That's why it's so important in Judaism to be called for a bar bat mitzvah, to be called to read from the Torah, because it's like an encounter with God. And so then let's say, okay, what is Torah? Is it just a set of words? Is it just a set of digits? Letters? No, it's much more. So a couple things. First of all, a Torah is a scroll, right? It's I should have brought one, but it's sewn together. It's lambskin sewn together, and it's written in a very particular way. Torah scrolls have been written in the same way for about 2,000, 2,500 years. And it takes about a year to write an entire Torah. And you have to be trained. You have to go through about a 5 or 10 year training to know exactly how to write a Torah scroll. It's also written with a very special pen dipped in an ink recipe that's been used for about 2,000 years. And the scribe has to say a blessing every time he begins writing in the scroll. In fact, when you write God's name, you have to say another blessing and use a different pen. And no metals are used in the construction of a Torah scroll because metals are a symbol of war and Torah is meant to be a symbol of peace. So you have this very elaborate custom for how a Torah is written. Traditionally, it was written by a male scribe. Now there are also female scribes, at least in the Reform movement, who write Torah scrolls. Everything is written every single marking over every little dot over a letter, every curve at the end of a letter, sometimes certain letters are bigger and certain letters are smaller. That's all done. It's almost like a computer program. It has to be exactly perfect. And if you make a mistake while writing a Torah, because people make, we're not robots, you make mistakes. There's a whole procedure for etching out the mistake and replacing it. If you mess up God's name, you have to start over the whole page. You don't have to start over the whole book. That's some people think that you don't. You just have to start over that particular page. Because the idea is that it's more than just a symbol. Typically, language is a symbol. It's just a way of conveying information. That's typically, language. No, I don't want to get all philosophical, but that's what language is. We exchange information. In Judaism, when you're writing a Torah scroll, it's more than just information. It's literally you are kind of like how the wine, if in a traditional Catholic perspective, the wine and the bread, unleavened bread, are literally the blood. Traditionally, it is actually the blood of Jesus. Transfiguration is an idea within Catholicism. In Judaism, the idea literally that words of Torah, that's God. And so you better be very careful while you're writing it. So that whole process is very complex. And then there is a whole procedure for reading Torah. So if you've been to a bar mitzvah, you probably have seen how people are called up to the Torah. Have you ever wondered why there's that? Have you ever wondered why you just don't take out, we've got the Torah in printed form. Why don't we just take out the Torah in printed form, read the section? Why even read it in Hebrew? Why not read it in English so people understand it? Have you ever wondered that? Why go through this whole procedure of reading Torah from a scroll in an ancient language, chanting it in a certain way, and then calling up people? That's called an Aliyah, where you go up and you say a blessing, and then you say it, and then a section of Torah is read, and then you say a concluding blessing. There's a whole process for reading Torah. And there's a couple reasons for that. First is that every time we read from the Torah, that is meant to kind of bring us back in time to the moment when God gives the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai. So that goes back to the book of Exodus, the 10 Commandments. Maybe you've seen the movie or the story, where God in lightning and thunder gives Moses the scrolls, and Moses brings it down, then he shatters them, and he goes back up and he gets another. But the idea is that when we read from the Torah scroll, we are reenacting that moment when God gave the Torah originally. Kind of like if you've ever done Passover, the whole idea of the Seder is that you are going back in time to that moment when the Israelites were fleeing Egypt and recreating that moment to remember it. So when we read from the Torah, we're recreating that moment at Mount Sinai. And then, so why is it important for a 13-year-old to do that? Why is that significant? Well, the idea is that in traditional Judaism, every single Jewish person was there at Mount Sinai when God gave the Torah 3,000 years ago. Timing 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Every single Jewish person was there. So you're thinking, that doesn't make any sense. That violates all the space-time continuum. How could we be there at Sinai? Well, the idea is that our souls, the souls of every person, were there at Mount Sinai, even if our bodies weren't. And that, when a 13-year-old reads from the Torah scroll, they are essentially re-experiencing that moment. They are taking their place among the Jewish people. That's why it's so important as a rite of passage that you are essentially entering your place. There's a metaphor used of the chain of tradition, and that every link in the chain matters. So you're essentially putting your link, marking your link in that chain. And that's what reading from the Torah does. You're reenacting that moment at Mount Sinai as you were there at Mount Sinai. And so that's why it's important to read from an actual scroll. And it takes a lot of work too. It's almost like, a rite of passage has a meaning if it takes something to accomplish. So if you think about graduating from college or high school, it takes work. And so entering your place in the Jewish people takes a little work. Now, the interesting thing about a Torah scroll is that it has no vowels. So it's very difficult to know how to read from a Torah scroll if you don't, if you are new to the Hebrew language. I mean, can you imagine reading English without any vowels? Now, probably because we're used to English, we probably could read a few things without vowels now, like the whole Wheel of Fortune. You figure things out. You figure, that's the whole point of the game, is somehow in our minds we know how to put together words without having everything there. But if we don't, it's not really our native language. That would be very hard. So it takes work to learn how to read from the Torah, and so that's what all the training for bar mitzvah is. It's learning how to read directly from the Torah. And go through that whole process. And it does take a lot of work. Now, the blessings over the Torah, that's known as the Aliyah. So the Hebrew word Aliyah, it literally means ascension. You're going up somewhere. So the idea is that when you say a blessing over the Torah, you are in some ways entering into a sacred space. Just like sometimes with couples that I marry, I talk about how, in a sense, before you go under the chuppah, you are different. You are a different person. When you stand under the chuppah, you're in kind of this liminal moment in time. And then when you leave the chuppah, you are a different person. You are now in a different state of being. You went under the chuppah as a single individual from a Jewish legal perspective, if you want to think of, or a spiritual perspective. And then when you leave the chuppah, you are now in a different state of being. And that transformation, in a way, happens while you are standing under the chuppah. I probably, this is slightly off topic, but really, a lot of people think when you sign the ketubah, that's when you're actually married. Not accurate. I don't tend to correct people when they say that. It's not polite, but really, the moment when a wedding takes place, literally the moment when a relationship is transformed from, engaged to married, is when the groom gives the bride a ring and says the words, by this ring you are consecrated unto me as my wife. And then the bride does the same thing. So that moment is literally when the transformation happens. And so in some ways, when you do an Aliyah, when you do a blessing over the Torah, you are in a time of transformation. You're going from a lower state of being essentially to a higher state of being. Then you come back down and you leave. But that Aliyah, that ascension is really a critical moment. So it's critical for the bar mitzvah, the bat mitzvah, and also for the person doing the blessing, parents or friends or whoever. So that's why there's so much ceremony around the reading of the Torah. It's almost in some ways the equivalent of communion in Christianity. Think about it. There is a part of the service where you literally go through a transformation, and the reading of the Torah is that moment. In a Jewish worship service. In addition, the Torah has kind of become a symbol of Judaism. Really, that a Torah scroll kind of represents the journey of the Jewish people. There was a poet in the 19th century, and he said the Torah is the portable homeland of the Jewish people. I think is a really good metaphor because, Judaism began as a people living in the land of Israel. Then, over time, the Romans destroyed the temple. The Jews migrated out of Israel, lived all over the world. Right now, Jews tend to live mainly in Israel and America. But for thousands of years, Jews had no homeland. But essentially, the text, the words of Torah, that was what connected Jews all over the world. The Jews spoke, like, if you go back 1,000 years, let's say to 1,000 or 1,100 CE, Jews spoke different languages. There were Jews living in France, and Rome, and Spain, all over, and they had very little in common except Torah. That was essentially what tied Jews all over the world together. That's why it's kind of so central to understanding what it means. And I think what's interesting is that in an interfaith context, in many ways, Torah is a great bridge because it is part of the Christian Bible. I mean, it's part of the Bible, and also it's a document. It's a source of wisdom for everyone. Now, the Torah. See, I mean, we could go into a whole different direction. Exactly, what is Torah? Like, what are the stories? Because it's somewhat disjointed. Most scholars think that the Torah itself was written over about 1,000 years. Now, the mythological idea is that God gave the Torah directly, but most scholars, if you study at a university, most scholars would say the Torah is a collection of stories written over about 1,000 years. And so you can imagine that there would be different types of stories if they're gathered over 1,000 years, which is exactly right. So there are parts of Torah that are beautiful spiritual ideas like the 10 Commandments and love your neighbor as yourself. That all comes from the Torah. Do justly, or justice shall you pursue. That comes from the Torah. And then there are also parts of the Torah, like in the book of Leviticus, where it says, you shouldn't mix wool and linen in your clothing. It's kind of like from the sublime to the mundane, and that's all contained in Torah. So we could talk about why that is, but before we do that, I'll get into some of the stories of the Torah a little bit. Any questions, comments, things you're wondering about kind of the whole ritual of reading Torah, bar and bat mitzvah, and how it's done? Come on, you gotta have some questions. Yeah.
I've heard once in a movie that the actual shape of the line is written.
Oh, that's a midrash that God gave the Torah with black fire. That the letters, when God wrote, or when Moses wrote the Torah as a scribe to God, that it was written in black fire on parchment. Yeah. So it's sort of it's a midrash, which is sort of a Jewish legend. Yeah. But the letters, Hebrew letters, are actually fascinating. So a lot of the letters come from life. Like, for example, one of the best examples is the Hebrew word for fish is dog, and the letter that is the main letter, the Daled, is shaped like a fish hook. And so the letters were derived from the lived experience of people. I mean, most languages start as oral, before we write things down, we speak them. And then over time, as you want to transmit information, I mean, this is sort of basic human evolution. If you want to transmit information, you start to write things down. You write things down. I mean, cave walls, that was where essentially, things were written down originally. And so a lot of the early Hebrew letters come out of activities. Some of it comes from human anatomy. Certain letters are based on human anatomy, and other letters are based on hunting and gathering, like with fish. And so it's really incredible. And the letters evolve, just like there are hundreds of different fonts, that you can use today. The way Hebrew letters were written, they start sort of very basic, very linear, and over time they become a little more decorative as people use them. But, yeah.
What is the relation as far as ritual with God?
That's great. Okay, so I didn't even mention the yad. So, yeah. The question was, what's the ritual relation between the yad, so a yad is, if you are reading from the Torah, you are not supposed to touch the scroll itself. Now, sometimes it happens, but generally, why is that? Well, because our hands, even if we wash them and use Purell, there's a lot of bacteria and oils and things on our hands. That's just how it is. And so, if we touch a Torah scroll, in some ways we are potentially harming the Torah, or at least impurifying it to a degree. And so we use what's called a yad in a pointer. It's just like it's like a pencil, a long pencil that you use to keep your place in the Torah scroll. And there are several the Torah is kind of garbed in these rituals. So there's a cover, it's called a paroket, that goes over the Torah, over the scroll, and that's in some ways to protect the scroll. And then there are breastplates and crowns that go on the Torah scroll. Now, part of that is the Torah is also meant to remind us of the ancient temple in Jerusalem. So the temple in Jerusalem, as depicted in Torah, is a place where the priests existed. And the priests were the ones who supervised sacrificial offerings going back thousands of years. These were sacrificial offerings to God. And the priest wore a breastplate, and the high priest would wear a crown. And so the breastplate and the crown on a Torah scroll is meant to remind us, even though priests don't exist anymore, even though there is no priesthood in Judaism, it's meant to remind us of that time a long time ago when the priest did exist. And the yad also goes on the Torah scroll, and that's essentially for practical purposes to keep our place in Torah. And all of these ritual items, there's a lot of art surrounding them. So I have a little collection of yads that people have given me over the years. There's yads from Turkey and from Israel and from Spain, and there's you can use this form, this ritual item to create art around it, and it's actually a beautiful part of Jewish tradition. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Is the numerical significant Hebrew letters that all alongside Torah, or is that separate?
It's a great question. So the question, just to repeat, is the numerical significance of the Hebrew letters. So if you ever go to a bar mitzvah, or maybe you got it for yourself, ever given a gift of $18 or received a gift of 36 or 72. So that is based on Jewish numerology. So every letter in Judaism has a numeric value. So going from Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3. Going all the way, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, then it's sort of like a decimal system, 10, 20, 30. So the reason 18 is important is it is the Jewish letters for the word chai, which means life. So essentially, you know how the Jewish toast is to life? Well, the word life is 18. And so to celebrate, and when you're celebrating somebody's life, you give $18. Now, as inflation happens, you go 18 to 36 to 72, it happens. That is the idea, is each letter has value. Now, whether it evolved, I don't really know. My guess is it probably did happen at the same time. It was almost like it's efficient. It's efficient if each letter also has a numeric value, because you can, there's a whole bunch. I've been reading a little bit of scholarship about this. The idea of, I don't know if there are any accountants in here, but people think some of the first writing that was ever done was essentially accounting tables of who owes what to who. And so it would make sense if letters had numeric value, because some of the oldest archaeological findings were ledgers, essentially. There's some ledgers found by the Dead Sea caves. And so it would make sense if you're accounting, this person took 2 barrels from here, that you would use letters to represent that. Yeah. Yes.
This started getting more arduous to read.
Why are such a great question. So why are there no vowels in Torah? Well, first of all, it's important to know it starts as an oral language. So when we're speaking, we're just speaking. We're not saying, I'm using 3 consonants and 2 vowels. We're just speaking. So, and generally, if we are familiar with a language and we write it down, all of us could probably get through most words in English without vowels. We'd be a little confused sometimes, but we could get through it. And that's essentially an Israeli newspaper today doesn't contain vowels. Yeah. So, unless you're reading those beginner newspapers where you try to learn how, but in general, if you pick up a copy of Haaretz, there's no vowels. So in some ways, when you are familiar with a language, you know well enough to understand what words mean in context. So you really don't need the vowels. However, with Torah, modern Hebrew is different than biblical Hebrew. So even people who really know modern Hebrew, they still need, it's called a tikkun. It's a sort of a cheat with like the answers. There are copies of the Torah with the vowels. So unless you are totally familiar with biblical Hebrew, you need another version of the Torah with vowels to get along. Now, so why is it not written with vowels originally? Probably because the people who wrote it down, they knew what all the vowels were. They knew how to read it. There's no period, there's no grammar either. There's no periods, there's no sentence starts, there's none of that. Because the people who wrote it down, they knew it. Now, as generations come and go, a lot of that knowledge is lost. Now, the interesting thing is that until about 1,000 years ago, there were competing vowel systems for Torahs. They were probably 95% similar, but different groups had different voweling. So there was no authoritative voweling system until about 1,000 years ago. There was a group of Jews called the Mazarites who lived in modern Tiberias, which is a beautiful little town in Israel. And they essentially created the authoritative vowel system. And the oldest Torah in existence is actually in a museum in the oldest voweled edition of a Torah scroll is in a museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. And that is the original Mazarite voweling system. That is what we have and use today. So, but just one other little point. The interesting thing is, sometimes words, you can actually, if you change the vowels for the same letters, they would mean totally different things. And it's kind of interesting. I use it in sermons sometimes to say, well, actually, we could read this word this way, and it would mean something totally different than we usually understand it. So it kind of allows the language to have a little bit of flexibility. Yeah.
Evan, I know we were all intrigued by what you said that you wanted to talk about concerning current world situation and how that relates to some of the stories. Before your time runs out, can you just give us some of those?
Totally. Yeah, I got caught up in Torah. So, so a lot of the stories in especially the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, Torah, they're all about family relationships. So think about the book of Genesis, where it starts off with, it's filled with sibling rivalry. Think about Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Joseph and his brothers, Jacob and Esau, I said, or Joseph and his brothers, all these sibling rivalries. And then it ends with a kind of, this is the book of Genesis, it ends with reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers. And I think about all those stories, and I think, we're living in such a time of such hostility. Right? You look around, politically, socially, culturally, within America, and other countries, there's so much tension. And I think in some ways that is the natural human condition. That is, and we see that in Torah. One of the first human acts is Cain killing his brother Abel. But what Torah is meant to do is kind of refine our character. And so how does that happen? That's sort of the interesting journey of Torah. And part of it is forgiveness. Joseph essentially forgives his brothers. But part of it is also, and this is actually one thing I talk about. Where is it? Yeah, I could actually, let me just read this because I think I explain it well. So we know, before Cain killing Abel, we know that God warns Cain to control his anger. God says to Cain, beware, don't let your anger overcome you. but Cain does not. Instead, we come upon the fateful verse. Cain said to his brother Abel. And then we have three in the Torah. There's like a little space. It's like the equivalent of 3 dots. And then they were in the field. Cain set upon his brother Abel and killed him. This verse is confusing. It begins by saying Cain said to his brother, but then it doesn't say what Cain said. It just says Cain said to his brother. Well, what did he say to his brother? We don't know. Now, certain translations of the Hebrew fill in the gap by supplying what Cain said. So one translation says, Cain said to his brother, let us go into the field, or something similar. But the original Torah scroll does not say that. And I think the gap is intentional. It implies that Cain did not really speak to Abel. He did not express his anger and frustration. He did not communicate at all. Real communication between Cain and Abel might have averted the murder. The Torah makes that possibility clearer in a later story about Joseph and his brothers. We will examine that story in detail later, but there is a moment when the brothers plan to kill Joseph, and then they talk about it, and they revise their plans. This communication seems to help them become more aware of their emotions and moderate their plans. The same thing could have happened between Cain and Abel, but Cain was unable to do so. So the idea is that, we live in a world where we barely, how many of you, if you're like me and my wife, we get a lot of our news on Facebook. I try to read other sources, but generally what Facebook does is it gives us like an algorithm to see only things we agree with generally. And so we generally don't talk with a lot of people that disagree with us. And I think part of what Torah is meant to convey is communication, and talking things through actually can help heal. Not all the time. And now we live in a kind of, when we talking right now is often talking in sound bites, right? Just saying, whatever sounds good. But kind of real communication actually is what can heal and transform us. And I think that the Torah is filled with stories like that. There's also stories about how we work together. One of the things in the book of Exodus, after the creation of the golden calf, you know that story where the Israelites are missing Moses, and they create a calf that they worship in place of Moses. Moses finds out, he comes back down and murders all the people that were, creating the calf. And the Jewish people are essentially broken at that point. But what brings them back together is building the tabernacle, the portable temple in the wilderness. And so this idea of a shared project, something that we do together, can also bring healing. So that's what I was thinking of when I was talking about how kind of Torah really is a guide for how we can kind of heal. By the way, as a married couple or an engaged couple, I don't know, does everyone agree on everything in a marriage? No, of course not. So talking things through, that's one of the things that, any healthy couple does is communicate. That doesn't mean you agree on everything. That's part of the beauty of marriage, is you have people that think differently from you. You have someone, that's wonderful. But the idea of, if you were never to tell your spouse how you were feeling, you would push yourself further apart. So I think that's true not only in marriages, but kind of in human nature as well. And I think that's one of the lessons Torah is teaching us. Okay, any other questions? Things you're wondering about Torah, about human nature, anything you've ever want to ask a rabbi? Yeah.
It's like how is there standardized?
Yeah. So trope, the question was about trope. Trope is the way we read from Torah. So this all goes back to the fact that Torah was originally oral. And you all know that if you want to remember something, it's much easier to remember the lyrics of a song than it is to remember like a poem or just a regular text. When we put something to music, it's easier to remember. So before the Torah was written down, it was literally sung. People would come up with a melody
for singing the words of Torah. And eventually, that melody was kind of given a language, a musical language called trope. And so that trope was written down. It's not in the original Torah text, but it's based on some of the markings that are in the Torah text. And so that trope is the melody for how we sing or chant the words of Torah. And it is standardized. So there is a standard trope for reading from Torah. But then, just to make things a little more complicated, there are also tropes for each holiday. So if you are reading Torah on Sukkot, there's a slightly different trope than if you're just reading Torah on a regular Shabbat. If you're reading on Purim and you're reading from the book of Esther, which isn't part of Torah, it's just part of the regular Bible, there's a special trope for that. So in some ways, if you are really knowledgeable, you could not even know it's a holiday, but you could learn it was a holiday by hearing the trope. And yeah, trope is really, it's hard to start. Once you get it, it's much easier, kind of like any language, but there is a standard trope for how we chant Torah. It's great. Any other questions? Yeah.
Talk about the evolution of Torah over thousands of years.
Yeah.
Has there been any change in customs with the Torah in the last 100, 200?
Well, that's a great question. Have there been changes in custom around the Torah? Well, I mean, the biggest change would be in the role of women in Reform and Conservative Judaism. So traditionally, there's actually, and this is a whole interesting, there actually is nothing in Jewish law that says women can't read from Torah. It just became a custom that only men did. And so, but really over the last 50 years, there have been, as we become a more egalitarian society, women read from Torah, carry Torah. Even in Orthodox communities, there are a few Orthodox communities where it's kind of interesting. What they will do for a bat mitzvah is essentially they will read from the Torah on a Friday night, which is not the traditional time of reading from the Torah. Traditional time is Saturday morning, Monday morning, and Thursday morning. That's actually an interesting, just a historical tidbit. We read Torah on Mondays, Thursdays, Shabbat, Saturdays. The reason Mondays and Thursdays is those were the market days in ancient Israel. And so in order for the Torah to reach the most people, you would read it on the market day when more people were in town so they could hear the words of the Torah. So I would say the biggest change over the last 50 or 100, 200 years is the role of women in reading Torah, carrying Torah. But other than that, it's pretty much stayed the same. I mean, one other difference is there used to be people who knew the entire Torah by heart and who knew all the commentaries by heart. There are fewer people who do that today because it's all online. There's all technology. Probably the biggest change, and this is even over the last 10 years, is just the ability of all the various commentaries, insights on Torah. A lot of it is now digitally available. So there's a really amazing website called Safarian, which was started by some former Google employees. And essentially what it does is you start with the text of Torah, you click on it, and then literally you have 80 different commentaries, at least 80. You can click on those, and then there are commentaries on the commentaries. So, and that's all, I mean, that's really just technology over the last 10 years. I mean, it's really incredible. So I'd say in the traditional realm of reading from Torah, very little change, but in the study of Torah, enormous progress. Yeah. Right, the role of Hebrew in bar and bat mitzvahs. Yeah, I've got kind of mixed feelings on it, to be honest with you. So my wife, who's also a rabbi, she is fine with essentially everything being in English. Maybe read a line or two in Hebrew from the Torah scroll, and most of it in English, because most American Jews don't speak any Hebrew, and it's almost, I went to a Jewish day school, so I kind of grew up speaking Hebrew from, when I was in first grade, so I kind of have a love of the language. And part of me thinks that even if we don't understand everything, there is a kind of a beauty in the language, and there's a connection that Jews have been speaking this language for thousands of years, and that if you know, not everyone's going to become proficient in Hebrew by any means, but if you know a little bit of Hebrew, you could go into a synagogue in Thailand or in Australia or anywhere, and you would be able to figure out a little bit of what's going on. So I think there is some value in doing a little bit of Hebrew in a bar mitzvah. Does it need to be extremely extensive? No, but no, not by any means. I mean, that's one big difference between Reform and Conservative Judaism. Generally, in a conservative synagogue, you do a lot more Hebrew. But I do think there is some value in having just a basic understanding of the Hebrew language. Yeah.
You think in the same terms of what we're saying now before we talk about writing passage and stuff like that, and how you have to work hard to do anything. If it gets to the point where society is making everything so simple and so easy, like, okay, let's not challenge anyone, let's not make anyone work harder for anything. Let's just, all right, just read it in English. I kind of, doesn't that go along with what you're saying, defeating some of the purpose of?
Yeah.
If you simplify things so much, then what do they mean?
Well, I mean, yes, that's a general truth, right? That you don't want to. You want to. It has to be somewhat of a challenge. Yes. I mean, you don't want to overwhelm a kid. I mean, we've had, certainly at my synagogue, we have kids that are very good with languages and can easily read a whole bunch of Hebrew, and some who struggle more. So, you have to kind of adapt. But yeah, I think there is some positivity in a challenge in getting some sense of the language. It's really interesting, I mean, regardless of the language itself, it's actually really good for our brains to learn different languages. I mean, I wish that I had started my kids learning Hebrew when they were little. I didn't, and it's too bad, but I think it could be good for the brain too. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any very cool
Yeah, I mean, really, there's such an interesting question about women becoming rabbis. Well, just what rabbi is traditionally, a rabbi was just a teacher. The traditional understanding of a rabbi was a teacher and a judge. A rabbi would judge disputes between people. They would say, is this kosher? Is that kosher? When the rabbinic role became more official, women initially were excluded. There was actually a bit, though, in Nazi Germany, there was a female rabbi named Regina Jonas, which is a very interesting story. But it wasn't until 1972 when the Reform movement officially ordained women, then the conservative movement in 1985. I was talking yesterday at a bar mitzvah with somebody who was an Orthodox female rabbi. Now, she wouldn't be recognized by some Orthodox people, but her father was an Orthodox rabbi, her grandfather, and her father actually nurtured her. So in theory, it exists today, but in practice, it's very uncommon. No, just custom, Yeah. No, first bat mitzvah is in 1922. But the idea why it wasn't is in Jewish law, only a man is responsible, obligated to perform the mitzvot. And the whole idea of a bar mitzvah was you are accepting the mitzvot. Now, of course, it's egalitarian and Reform conservative. Thank you guys so much. What a great discussion. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you very much.